The photograph arrived at the Westfield Historical Society on a cold February morning in 2024, tucked inside a water-stained envelope with no return address. Sarah Mitchell, the Society's lead archivist, almost dismissed it as another dusty family portrait until she looked closer. The image showed a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, seated in an ornate Victorian chair. She wore a white lace dress with delicate embroidery, her dark hair pulled back with a ribbon. In her lap rested a teddy bear, its fur surprisingly well preserved in the sepia tones of the photograph. The girl's face was serene, almost peaceful, her eyes gazing directly at the camera with an unsettling stillness. But something felt wrong. Sarah adjusted her desk lamp, leaning forward until her nose nearly touched the protective sleeve. The girl's hands, small, pale hands clutching the teddy bear, looked strange. The fingers appeared rigid, unnaturally positioned, as if they had been carefully arranged rather than naturally gripping the toy. "That's odd," Sarah whispered to herself. She grabbed her magnifying glass and examined the hands more closely. The skin tone seemed different from the girl's face, slightly darker, mottled in places. And there, just visible beneath the lace cuff of the dress, was what looked like a thin wire or rod supporting the wrist. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had seen enough Victorian photographs to recognize the telltale signs, but this one was different. The date inscribed in faded ink at the bottom read, November 1902, Hartford, Connecticut. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the magnifying glass. If her suspicion was correct, this wasn't just an old photograph. This was a memorial portrait, a post-mortem photograph taken after death. But the presence of the teddy bear complicated everything. Teddy bears had only just been invented in 1902, making this image extraordinarily rare. And there was something else, something she couldn't quite articulate yet. A detail hidden in plain sight that would change everything she thought she knew about this photograph and the child within it. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That evening, back in her small apartment overlooking Main Street, she pulled out her research materials on Victorian mourning customs and post-mortem photography. The practice had been common in the mid to late 1800s, particularly among families who had lost children. In an era when infant mortality rates were devastating and photography was still relatively new and expensive, a post-mortem photograph often became the only visual memory families had of their deceased loved ones. Photographers would pose the deceased to appear as lifelike as possible, sometimes seated in chairs, sometimes held by family members, occasionally even positioned to look as though they were sleeping peacefully. Special stands and wires helped support the bodies, and careful lighting could disguise the pallor of death. By 1902, however, the practice was already declining. Modern embalming techniques, combined with faster photographic processes, meant families could more easily capture images of the living. Post-mortem photography was becoming increasingly rare, especially in urban areas like Hartford. Sarah opened her laptop and began searching historical records. Hartford in 1902 was a prosperous manufacturing city, home to insurance companies, gun factories, and a growing middle class. The city's population had swelled to nearly 80,000 people. With immigrants arriving from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe seeking work in the factories along the Connecticut River, she typed into the database, Hartford, Connecticut, child deaths, November 1902. The screen filled with results. Diphtheria had swept through the working-class neighborhoods that autumn. Scarlet fever had claimed several children in the North End. A tenement fire on Franklin Avenue had killed 2 siblings. But nothing matched the girl in the photograph. The expensive dress, the elaborate studio setting, the carefully staged composition suggested a family of means, not factory workers struggling in crowded tenements. Sarah enlarged the photograph on her screen again, studying every detail. The backdrop behind the girl showed painted columns and draped fabric, typical of a professional studio. The chair was ornate, possibly mahogany, with carved details that suggested quality craftsmanship. And then there was the teddy bear. Sarah spent the next morning in the Society's reference library, surrounded by books about early 20th century American culture. What she discovered about the teddy bear made the photograph even more extraordinary. The teddy bear had been invented, or rather, named, in November 1902, the exact month shown on the photograph. The toy was inspired by a widely publicized incident involving President Theodore Roosevelt, who had refused to shoot a captured bear during a hunting trip in Mississippi. A political cartoon depicting the scene went viral in newspapers across the country, and almost immediately, toy makers began producing stuffed bears called Teddy's Bears. Morris Mictom, a Brooklyn shopkeeper, created one of the first teddy bears and even wrote to Roosevelt asking permission to use his name. The president agreed, and by late November 1902, teddy bears were being sold in shops along the East Coast. This photograph had been taken at the precise moment when teddy bears were brand new, perhaps one of the first times such a toy appeared in a post-mortem portrait. But why would a family include such a modern, cheerful toy in a death portrait? The contrast seemed jarring, almost cruel. Sarah pulled out a directory of Hartford photographers from 1902. There were 6 studios operating in the city that year: Thompson & Sons on Pearl Street, the Artistic Portrait Studio on Main Street, Berenson Brothers near Bushnell Park, and 3 smaller operations in the neighborhoods. She examined the photograph's backing, hoping for a photographer's mark or stamp. Nothing, just the date and location written in careful script. Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus Chen, a colleague who specialized in photographic authentication and restoration at Yale University. She had emailed him the image the previous night, asking for his expert opinion. "Sarah, this is remarkable," his text read. "Can you bring the original to New Haven? I need to examine it in person. There's something about the composition that doesn't quite add up. The lighting is wrong for 1902 studio work, and the focus is too sharp in certain areas. Either this photographer was extraordinarily skilled or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood the implication. Either they were looking at the work of a master photographer whose name had been lost to history, or something about this photograph wasn't what it appeared to be. She carefully placed the photograph back in its protective sleeve, grabbed her coat, and headed for her car. Marcus Chen's laboratory at Yale occupied a converted carriage house behind the university's Art Conservation Center. Inside, the space was filled with specialized cameras, light tables, and chemical analysis equipment, everything needed to authenticate and restore historical photographs. Marcus himself was in his 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail and reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead. He had examined thousands of historical images, from Civil War battlefield photographs to early Hollywood portraits, and his reputation for spotting forgeries was unmatched. "Let me see it," he said, barely waiting for Sarah to remove her coat. She handed him the protective sleeve, and Marcus carried it to a light table in the center of the room. He switched on the illumination, and the photograph seemed to glow from beneath. For several minutes, Marcus said nothing. He moved a high-powered magnifying lens across the image, pausing occasionally to make notes on a yellow pad. Sarah watched his expression shift from curiosity to confusion to something that looked like disbelief. "The paper stock is correct for 1902, he finally said. "I can tell by the weight and the coating. The chemical composition of the emulsion would need testing, but visually, it matches the period." "But," Sarah prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but the photographic technique is too advanced. Look here," he pointed to the girl's hands. "The depth of field is perfect. The fingers are in sharp focus while the background is slightly soft. That kind of selective focus required equipment and skill that was rare in 1902, especially for post-mortem work, which was usually rushed and crude by this point in the practice's history." He moved the magnifying lens to the teddy bear, and this is even stranger. "Look at the texture of the fur. You can see individual threads in the fabric. The level of detail is extraordinary." Sarah leaned over the light table. "What does that mean?" Marcus straightened up, removing his glasses. "It means whoever took this photograph was either a genius working with custom equipment or..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Or this photograph documents something more significant than a simple memorial portrait." He walked to his computer and pulled up the digital scan Sarah had sent him. With a few keystrokes, he enhanced different areas of the image, adjusting contrast and brightness. "There," he said, pointing to the screen. Sarah stepped closer to Marcus's computer screen, her heart beating faster. He had isolated and enhanced a small section of the photograph, the area just behind the girl's left shoulder, where the painted studio backdrop showed draped fabric. "Do you see it?" Marcus asked. At first, Sarah saw nothing unusual, just the typical Victorian studio background, meant to suggest wealth and refinement. But as her eyes adjusted to the enhanced image, she noticed something peculiar. Barely visible marks in the painted fabric that didn't match the random folds and shadows. "Is that writing?" she whispered. "Not quite," Marcus said. "But look at the pattern. These marks are too regular to be accidental. They repeat every few inches." He zoomed in further. "I think they're deliberate. Someone wanted to leave information in this photograph." He switched to a different enhancement filter, and suddenly the marks became clearer. They weren't letters, but symbols, small geometric shapes that appeared to form a sequence. Could it be a photographer's mark? Sarah suggested. Some kind of signature or studio identification? Marcus shook his head. Photographers' marks were always visible, usually printed or stamped on the front or back. This was meant to be hidden, only visible with modern technology and enhancement. He turned away from the computer and picked up the original photograph again, examining it under natural light. There's something else. Look at the girl's dress. The embroidery on the collar. Sarah leaned in. The needlework showed a pattern of flowers and vines, typical of the era. But as Marcus adjusted the angle of the light, certain threads seemed to catch the illumination differently than others. Metallic thread, he said, mixed in with the regular cotton. That was expensive and unusual for children's clothing, even in wealthy families. He paused, unless the embroidery itself was meant to convey something, like a coded message sewn into the fabric. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying this photograph contains hidden information? Deliberately placed by the photographer or the family? I'm saying this image is far more complex than it appears. The post-mortem aspect might be real, but there's another layer to this story, something we're only beginning to uncover. Marcus returned to his computer and opened a new program. I'm going to run a full spectral analysis. We'll photograph this under different light wavelengths, ultraviolet, infrared, different filters. If there's more hidden in this image, we'll find it. While Marcus conducted his technical analysis, Sarah drove back to Hartford with a new mission. If the photograph contained hidden messages, then understanding who the girl was and who her family was became even more critical. The Hartford Public Library's genealogy room occupied the entire third floor of the main branch downtown. Rows of filing cabinets held birth records, death certificates, city directories, and newspaper archives dating back to the city's founding in 1636. Sarah signed in and requested the death records for Hartford County from October through December 1902. The librarian, an elderly woman named Ruth who had worked there for 40 years, brought out 3 large bound volumes and set them on the research table. Looking for someone specific, Ruth asked. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, would have died in November 1902, probably from a wealthy family. Ruth adjusted her own glasses. November 1902? That was when the diphtheria outbreak was worst in the North End. We lost 23 children that month. Sarah began working through the records, reading each entry carefully. Most of the documented deaths were in working-class neighborhoods, children of factory workers, immigrants, laborers. The causes were grimly repetitive: diphtheria, scarlet fever, pneumonia, accidents. Then, on page 47, she found something different. November 18, 1902. Name, Eleanor. Age, 8 years. Parents, names redacted. Residence, Asylum Avenue. Cause of death, undetermined. Sarah's hand froze over the page. Undetermined was unusual for that era, when doctors routinely listed causes of death, even if they were guessing. And Asylum Avenue was one of Hartford's most prestigious addresses, home to insurance executives, factory owners, and old money families. But what really caught her attention was the notation added in different ink at the bottom of the entry. Photograph taken. Special request. See medical examiner's file. Ruth appeared at her shoulder. Find something? Eleanor. 8 years old. Asylum Avenue. Do you have medical examiner's files from that period? Ruth's expression changed. Those files are in the restricted collection. They require special permission to access because they contain sensitive medical information. But, she glanced around the empty room. I've been here long enough to know when something matters. Wait here. Ruth returned 20 minutes later, carrying a thin folder marked with the Hartford City seal. I shouldn't be doing this, she whispered, but the case is over a century old. I don't think Eleanor's privacy needs protecting anymore. Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were 3 documents: a 2-page medical examiner's report, a handwritten letter on official city stationery, and a small envelope marked photographic evidence. The medical examiner's report was dated November 19, 1902, 1 day after Eleanor's recorded death. The examining physician was Dr. Harrison Webb. The city's chief medical examiner, Sarah read aloud, her voice quiet in the empty room. The subject, a female child of approximately 8 years, was examined at the request of the family and the Hartford Police Department. Physical examination revealed no obvious external injuries or marks suggesting violence. However, several anomalies were noted. The subject's extremities, hands and feet, displayed unusual discoloration and rigidity that appeared inconsistent with the reported time of death. The pattern of lividity did not match the position in which the body was discovered. More concerning, examination of the subject's fingertips revealed traces of a substance resembling photographic chemicals, specifically silver nitrate, commonly used in the developing process. The presence of these chemicals on a child of this age raises questions about her activities prior to death. Additionally, the family reported that Eleanor had been complaining of headaches and dizziness for approximately 2 weeks before her death, symptoms she attributed to the smell in the dark room. When questioned, the family confirmed that Eleanor had been spending considerable time in her father's photographic studio, located in the basement of their Asylum Avenue residence. Cause of death: suspected poisoning, likely chronic exposure to photographic chemicals. Manner of death: accidental. Recommend further investigation into safety practices in amateur photographic studios. Sarah looked up at Ruth. She was poisoned by photography chemicals? It happened more often than people realize, Ruth said quietly. Early photography used incredibly toxic substances: mercury, silver nitrate, potassium cyanide. Amateur photographers working in poorly ventilated spaces often suffered poisoning without realizing it. Children were especially vulnerable. Sarah returned to the file and opened the letter beneath the medical report. It was dated November 25, 1902, and addressed to Dr. Webb from someone named J.M., no full name given. Dr. Webb, regarding the Eleanor case, I must insist that certain details be omitted from the public record. The family's standing in Hartford society makes this matter delicate. Sarah photographed every document with her phone, then carefully returned the file to Ruth. Back in her car, she called Marcus immediately. The girl's name was Eleanor, she said without preamble. She died from chemical poisoning, probably from her father's photography studio. He was an amateur photographer, worked in the basement of their home on Asylum Avenue. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus said, Sarah, you need to come back to New Haven right now. I found something in the spectral analysis. An hour later, Sarah stood in Marcus's lab, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. He had photographed the original image under infrared light, which could reveal details invisible to the naked eye. What appeared was stunning. Beneath the visible photograph was another image entirely, a ghostly underexposure showing the same scene, but from a slightly different angle. It's a double exposure, Marcus explained. The photographer took 2 pictures on the same plate, probably seconds apart. In the first exposure, you can barely see it, but the girl's position is different. Her head is tilted more to the left, and her eyes, he zoomed in. Her eyes are closed, Sarah's breath caught. But in the final image, her eyes are open. Exactly. Which means the father, because I'm certain now that he took this photograph, posed her at least twice. He was experimenting, trying to get the perfect post-mortem portrait of his daughter. But there's something else. Marcus switched to another enhanced view, this time focusing on the background symbols they had identified earlier. Under infrared light, the symbols were much clearer, and they formed recognizable numbers and letters. It's a date and initials, Marcus said. November 12, 1902, EAH, 6 days before Eleanor's recorded death. Sarah felt the room spin slightly. That's impossible. The medical examiner's report said she died on November 18th. Then either the date on the photograph is wrong or... Marcus met her eyes. Or Eleanor was photographed 6 days before she was officially declared dead. Which raises a very disturbing question. What was happening to her during those 6 days? Sarah thought back to the medical report, to Dr. Webb's notes about the unusual rigidity and discoloration of Eleanor's hands, about the inconsistent lividity. Marcus, what if she wasn't dead when this photograph was taken? What if her father posed her while she was still alive but already dying? Sarah spent the next 3 days buried in research, piecing together the story of Eleanor and her family. What she discovered was both heartbreaking and disturbing. The 1900 Hartford City Directory listed an Edmund A. Holbrook at 247 Asylum Avenue, a prominent insurance executive and amateur photography enthusiast. Edmund's wife, Catherine, had died in 1899, leaving him to raise Eleanor alone, with the help of household staff. Newspaper archives from the Hartford Courant revealed that Edmund Holbrook had won several awards for his photographic work at local exhibitions. Critics praised his technical mastery and innovative techniques. He was particularly known for his portraits, which captured an unusual depth and clarity, but there was a darker thread running through the records. In October 1902, just a month before Eleanor's death, a brief news item mentioned that Edmund Holbrook had been treated at Hartford Hospital for nervous exhaustion and respiratory distress, symptoms consistent with chronic chemical exposure. Sarah found an interview with a former maid who had worked in the Holbrook household, published in 1925 in a local history journal. The woman, then in her 70s, recalled, "Mr. Holbrook was devoted to his daughter, but his photography had become an obsession. He spent hours in the basement darkroom and little Eleanor would sit with him watching him work. He said she was his perfect model, so still, so patient. Even when she started getting sick, she would pose for him because she knew it made him happy." The full picture was devastating. Edmund Holbrook, consumed by grief over his wife's death and obsessed with preserving memories through photography, had unknowingly poisoned his daughter with the very chemicals he used in his art. And as Eleanor grew sicker, weaker, more pale and still, he continued to photograph her, creating images that anticipated the post-mortem portraits that would soon follow. The photograph that Sarah had discovered wasn't taken after Eleanor's death. It was taken during her final days when she was so weak that she could barely move, her skin already taking on the pallor of death, her fingers too rigid to properly grasp the teddy bear that her father had bought to cheer her. The hidden date, November 12th, marked not her death, but the last time she was strong enough to sit for her father's camera. 6 days later she would die, and Edmund, unable to accept his role in her death, would date the photograph as a post-mortem portrait, a memorial, rather than a document of his daughter's suffering. Sarah stood before the display case at the Westfield Historical Society, looking at the photograph that now had a permanent place in their collection. Beside it was a placard telling Eleanor's story, not the sanitized version that Edmund Holbrook had wanted history to remember, but the full painful truth. Eleanor Holbrook, 1894-1902. This photograph represents both the artistic heights and the tragic dangers of early photography. Eleanor died from chronic poisoning caused by exposure to photographic chemicals in her father's amateur studio. The image, long believed to be a post-mortem portrait, was actually taken 6 days before her death, capturing a child in the final stages of illness. The exhibition had opened 2 weeks earlier, and the response had been overwhelming. Historians, photographers, and toxicologists had all reached out, fascinated by the case. Several universities requested permission to include Eleanor's story in their curricula on occupational health history and the history of photography. But for Sarah, the most meaningful response came from a descendant of Edmund Holbrook, his great-great-grandson, a retired teacher living in Boston. He had written to thank her for uncovering the truth. "Our family always had whispers about Eleanor, but no one knew the full story. My great-grandfather apparently destroyed most of Edmund's papers before his own death. I think he was ashamed. But Eleanor deserves to be remembered not as an anonymous child in a curiosity photograph, but as a real person whose death meant something. Her story might prevent future tragedies. That's a legacy worth having." Sarah had framed the letter and hung it in her office, next to the reproductions Marcus had made of the infrared analysis, the ghostly double exposure that revealed Eleanor's closed eyes, the hidden date, the coded messages that Edmund had buried in his work. The teddy bear in the photograph now seemed especially poignant, a father's desperate attempt to bring joy to his dying daughter, a symbol of the very newness and modernity that characterized 1902, placed in the hands of a child who would never have a chance to grow up and experience the 20th century. As visitors passed through the exhibition, Pausing to read Eleanor's story and examine the haunting image, Sarah hoped they understood what she had learned through months of investigation, that every old photograph holds secrets, that history is never as simple as it appears, and that the truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be remembered. Eleanor's fingers would never seem alive in that photograph, because they captured a moment when life was already slipping away. But her story was alive now, rescued from obscurity, a testament to both the beauty and the danger of trying to freeze time in light and shadow.